Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodholt. When I was serving a church in Myrtle Beach, rather often I needed to travel to Charleston to the medical university to see a church member who was receiving health care there. If you aren't from South Carolina, you might not know this, but the road from Myrtle Beach to Charleston is one of the most boring roads you can imagine. It's flat, and most of it is in a national forest, so all you see is trees. And when there is something else to look at, you take every opportunity to do so. One time when I was driving down just south of a small town called Awendaw, I saw an African Methodist Episcopal church and paid attention to it as I passed. It was called Mount Nebo AME Church. I thought, Mount Nebo? With all the mountains mentioned in the Bible where great things of faith happened, why would anyone name their church after Mount Nebo? Mount Nebo is where Moses stood to get his only glimpse of the Promised Land. And all of a sudden, I knew that this was a great name for a church. From Mount Nebo, you can glimpse the Promised Land. They were saying the same thing about their church. From there, in the music and in God's Word, they glimpsed heaven. So sometimes when I pass a church, I'm intrigued by the name and wonder who named it that and why they chose that name. I even wonder if the people in my own church here ever think about their church being named Redeemer and what it means to belong to a church named after the work of Jesus to redeem us. Walter Brueggemann is one of my favorite writers of biblical scholarship. I was recently paging through his book called Reverberations of Faith, and in this book he highlights important themes in the Old Testament, and I noticed that there were 5 significant ones listed under the letter R. We're going to explore those this week, starting with redemption. According to Brueggemann, in the Old Testament, the word redemption at first applied to family obligations. In those early days of faith, the Redeemer was a member of the family and often what we might call the next of kin or the closest relative. This person was responsible for protecting the honor of a family member and preserving family property that may be at risk. Let me explain a little bit more about that property issue. When the Hebrew people entered the Promised Land, the land was divided up among tribes and families by casting lots, something like casting a pair of dice. A piece of land would be put up and you would work through all the tribes or families saying, if the number is 6 or below, this person is chosen, and if it is 7 or above, then that person. They firmly believed that God would fix it so that the outcome would be what God wanted. The implication was that God wanted that person to get the property and to have it. The land was given to your family by God. Therefore, you needed to do everything you could to keep it. So if a family member fell into debt or died, or the property was about to be sold off, it was the obligation of a close family member to buy, or as they would say, redeem the land and keep it within the family God had gifted it to. But there was more to this idea of redemption. It also applied to marriage relationships. A good place to find this spelled out is in Deuteronomy 25 and also in the story of Ruth. In Deuteronomy it says that it is clearly mandated that if a man dies, his brother must marry his widow. This happened for 2 reasons. First, there were no societal protections or opportunities in that day for women without a husband. So, this family marriage, this redemption of the woman, provided her security and a livelihood so that she didn't starve or become destitute. The second part of this was that the family was preserved for the brother who had died. When the brother married the widow, if they had children, they were considered children and heirs of the man who had died. That way, the family is redeemed and preserved for the future. The story of Ruth clearly illustrates that, as Boaz is the next closest kinsman and marries Ruth, thereby redeeming her. Now, that may be interesting, but watch this. This concept quickly became applied to God, and throughout the Old Testament, God is portrayed as the Redeemer of Israel, as the next of kin who acts to preserve Israel's life and protect its future. Things like the Exodus or the return of the people from exile in Babylon were seen as acts of God to save and redeem God's people. Because of them, Israel was preserved, protected, and returned home and to well-being. Throughout the Bible, often in Psalms, they called on God to be their Redeemer. Suddenly we are back to the name of this church, Redeemer. When the church is named Redeemer, we think of the work of Christ, our next of kin. And it's amazing to think of Jesus so close to us. But more, we also think of his work to save us or to redeem us. Christ has claimed us as his family and has acted to preserve us in the family of God forever. We receive his protection, and in his love we are returned home to be with Christ. We are saved. That's good news whether you belong to a church named Redeemer or not. You belong to the family of God, and you have a Redeemer who acts to claim you and who will never let you go. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.